very happy to welcome you to our meeting on Syria this afternoon. Both our organizations are extremely grateful to the General Arab Women Federation and to the Union of Arab Jurists who have helped us organize this meeting. We're also extremely grateful to the help that we've received from the staff of the Permanent Mission of the Russian Federation, who, as ever, have been helpful in organizing and in publicizing the meeting. We're extremely honored to welcome in the room this afternoon His Excellency Monsignor Silvano Tomasi, the permanent representative of the Holy See. And we're delighted that you've been able to come to our meeting this afternoon, the title of which is Syria, the Path to Peace and the Challenges of Reconciliation. This is the third meeting that our two organizations have now held in 1 year, within the space of just over 1 year, on Syria. The first occurred on the 7th of March 2013, when, thanks to Mother Agnes, who is going to be one of the speakers again today, we brought 5 Syrians, a small cross-section, I believe, of Syrian society, to talk about the nature of the rebellion. At that stage, a year ago, there was a lot of media confusion about the real nature of the rebellion. A lot of the initial euphoria about an Arab Spring still dictated a lot of media opinion about Syria. Little by little, I think it's fair to say that that image of the rebellion has now changed, even in the European and American media. Our second meeting in June, on the 7th of June 2013, was held at a time when the crisis had greatly increased, in the sense that a threat of a military attack by America and its allies was very present. There had been, a few days before our meeting on the 7th of June, an apparent chemical attack in Syria, and this was used at that time in June as one of the justifications for a military intervention. In other words, our meeting this afternoon takes place under very different political conditions. The geopolitical situation, the international situation has changed with respect to what it was in June. However, the challenge of reconciliation for Syrians on the ground remains. In the last year, since we first brought our Syrian speakers and speakers from the Middle East to Geneva, they, particularly Mother Agnes, but also her colleagues in the reconciliation movement, have been in close contact with various parts of the United Nations administration, with the Commission of Inquiry, and also with the Office of Navi Pillai, who addressed our meeting in June. Over that period, Mother Agnes and her colleagues in the Musala movement have had a lot of experience with the United Nations and with its work on human rights in Syria, and that will be one of the subjects that she is going to address in her speech today, as will the other Syrian speakers. Both Mother Agnes and the Musalaha movement, of which she is a prominent member, have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in Syria over the past year and a half, 2 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, let me first of all, on behalf of the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, the oldest Russian non-governmental organization that I represent, to welcome the courageous Syrian participants who, in accordance with their civic duty, present today the reports and testimony of what is really happening in Syria events. As John said, for the third time, in collaboration with Paris Institute of Democracy and Cooperation on the field session of UN Council on Human Rights, we hold the conference Syria, the Path to Peace. Our efforts are not the voice of the wilderness. We can judge it by reaction of Mrs. Carla Del Ponte, as John expresses, and Carla Del Ponte issued a statement that the Syrian governmental troops didn't use chemical weapons in the area of Aleppo on March 19th. The war in Syria not is the war on religious grounds. We must understand that in Syria is a ruthless war with international terrorists from radical Islamic groups and organizations that seek to create in the country the Islamic caliphate and sets their order. The diplomatic efforts of Russia and President Vladimir Putin prevented the rocket and bomb strikes, power military pressure on Syria, which would have considerably expanded the scale of the humanitarian disaster in this country and would destroy civilization heritage of this divine land, part of the Holy Land. But Syria is still a pain and unhealed wound of all mankind, despite attempts of conducting the negotiation process in Montreal, and we consider that negotiations must continue on Syrian peace settlement. During 3 years, we have seen how the radical Islamic groups, fueled by outside, deliberately destroys infrastructure of Syria, mosques, churches, monasteries, Christian shrines, kill and kidnap priests and nuns, who bring to the world the human values and love to neighbor. In special cruelty and violence are Christians. And we are happy that 2 days ago, Mother Pelagia from Monastery St. Thecla from Maalula was released from captivity, and other nuns also. But IOPS expresses particular concern and the incident near Aleppo when militants captured 2 high and famous hierarchs, Metropolitan of Aleppo Paul and Gregorius John Ibrahim. We know that in deep concern about fate of Catholic priest Dal Olia and the representatives from Vatican, he was also kidnapped in Syria. Some days ago, with IOPS President Sergei Stepashin, we met in Vatican with Pope Francis, who, as everybody knows, stands for a political settlement in Syria, for preventing the forced pressure on Syria and proliferation of the humanitarian catastrophe. We agreed with Vatican on joint humanitarian action in support of the Christian population in Syria, which is admittedly threatens genocide. The IOPS appeals to the High Commissioner, to the international humanitarian NGO, and to all people of goodwill to unite their efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to the people in war and to preservation of spiritual and cultural heritage of Syria, maintaining interconfessional peace and accord, protection violence and persecution. This is our obligation and sacred duty. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I join the welcoming words to all of you. Thank you very much for your interest to this bleeding sore of humanity, as is Syria. And I would like to be very short. I think that if we do not curb the violence in Syria, if we do not shout with our loud voices about human rights violations, if we do not condemn the religious fanatism and obscurantism, we will see very soon spreading much wider this violence, because these trigger-happy people who arrogantly claim that they are instruments of God, killing for God's will, etc. They recruit now, which is a dangerous train, also Europeans and former Christians, because you can pass across facts of so-called white Al-Qaeda. Very many, thousands already, non-Arabs and non-Muslims originally, Europeans, among them also some Ukrainians I came across surprisingly, are fighting with those so-called rebels there, and the whole territory of adjacent countries becomes also the roots of trafficking material, drugs, for covert operations, for trafficking resources to help the extremists in Syria and the Middle East, who will contaminate also Lebanon and Jordan, and they will not disappear if the international community doesn't stand up and takes all sorts of measures against it. I know also that trafficking of resources, that is money, internet resources, so many things already is spreading over the whole Mediterranean, even Black Sea. Such an organization as Hizbut Tahrir has an organization in Crimea also, and I've seen the interview of his leader that he can't prevent the private citizens if they want to fight in Syria. So that is a dangerous trend which endangers also the world, which now thinks that he can be aside and nothing will touch its comfortable and non-aligned life. But we as Christians know that you can't be not participating in the everlasting fight between good and evil. That is our duty before God and mankind. So thank you very much for coming, and our primary task of our Institute for Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, and as for the Palestine Imperial Orthodox Society, is to organize events where we can give the platform for those voices who are not finding due coverage in the Western and universal media. So we are welcoming our Syrian friends, Mother Agnes, our heroine. Thank you very much. I think we'll start to discuss substantial issue.
As Natalia Narushnitska has just said, one of the tasks of the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris is to deal specifically with the issue of human rights and with the way in which human rights can be instrumentalized for political purposes. I'm sure it's not a secret to anyone here in this room that very early on in the Syrian conflict, the West, broadly speaking, had a human rights approach to that conflict. It concentrated very strongly on the various abuses that were allegedly being committed, various atrocities and so on. One of the main themes, I believe, of the Syrian speakers is going to be to ask whether or not that human rights analysis did indeed correspond to the reality.
If I should talk to myself and make a chronological summary about how the Syrian crisis became a deadliest tragedy, I would write straight ahead: disinformation, disinformation, disinformation. First, disinformation on a media informative level. The journalistic reports were false, counterfeited, and unlawful on a world scale. This is regrettable for the profession and in contradiction with the Munich Chart of Journalism. For example, it is said in the first declaration of this Munich Chart, respecting the truth no matter what consequences it may bring about to him, and this is because the right of the public is to know the truth. Second, disinformation. It's on a world political leading level. All the real objectives of the political decision makers and executives were hidden under false, pompous, and angelical-like titles. The result is a global misbehave of the supreme world political leaders in total discrepancy with the international laws, thus applied with a capricious and tyrannical mood. And third, sadly, disinformation on a humanitarian monitoring level. International NGOs dedicated to peace, justice, and human rights monitoring, I will not cite them here, and even United Nations global agencies are acting in baffling symbiosis with the unfair political hypocrisy, issuing humanitarian statements that can be defined as politically aligned, biased, and even false, to the point that humanitarian statements containing unfair accusations became a ready-to-take lever to justify paradoxically proxy wars, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Humanitarian NGOs and agencies added their voices to states involved in destroying Syria. They manipulated the public opinion to the point that international humanitarian laws and the right to protect law became Trojan horses to foster the foreign invasions of a sovereign state by hordes of mercenaries, and when the destruction has weakened the Syrian army, they claim to finish the destructive work under the 7th chapter of the United Nations Charter. Now, about the anti-government armed group. Some anti-government armed group mistreated and tortured persons in their custody, while such violations were committed in isolated instances. There are strong indications that such practices are on the rise. Dear ladies and gentlemen, this is a total disfigurement of the reality in Syria. I have, and I will bring to Geneva, opponents that are living in rebel-held environment, that are screaming and asking the Syrian army to come and realize, apply its duty to protect them. In Yabrut, for example, today, they are screaming, when will you come to help us and deliver us? When a commission of inquiry describe to you the situation like this, you will believe it, and you will not believe us, and you will politicize us, and you will say that we are not right. It's the best for you to do is to come and see with your own eyes what is happening on the Syrian ground. Now I finish with Adra, the horrendous invasion of Adra. I have here in my computer horrendous documentaries that reflect some of the terrible fate of citizens whose unique fault is to be state employees or from another religious minorities, a part of a non-radical Sunni community, or simply to be used as a means of pressure through terror by foreign mercenaries framed with some Syrian armed group. How the international community, who says that its first concern is the international humanitarian law and the right to protect, is accepting that some of the most prominent states within the United Nations finance, arm, and protects horde of terrorists that lacks of the most elementary principle of humanity and are using atrocities to implement the reign of terror in a way to have a rapid control on the ground. What I can state here about Adra is that it is totally ignored by the reports of the Commission. Its horrendous profile will remain a shame and a scandal when it will be unveiled. I let Dr. Nabil Fayyad convey to you his interviews with Adra survivors, a task that should have been performed by the Commission Inquirer. Even though we brought some prominent witnesses to Lebanon to be interviewed, how it is possible that nothing was said about what is becoming the summary of all inhuman realities in Syria? Thank you.
The development in Syria today cause profound concern and anxiety for the fate of Christianity in the country. Syria is a cradle of the Christianity. It is in Syria that one of the first Christian communities emerged in the 1st century, and the very name of Christians has come from. Christians are not merely a minority, but the native population of that country, and they have lived there for 20 centuries. After Islam came to Syria, Christians and Muslims used to live peacefully for many centuries until recent time. Syria used to show to the world an example of interreligious harmony. Today, this interreligious balance is grossly violated. What is happening there today is a real, I will dare to say, genocide unleashed against Christians and other religious minorities. It seems to be a purposeful policy pursued by extremists and terrorist forces. We are aware that Syrian conflict is not merely a conflict going on in a particular country. It is a continuation of the process carried out in a number of Middle East countries, in which radical elements are gaining strength, undermining the interconfessional peace.
Everyone is crying and mourning to see the daily suffering of the Syrian people. But what do they do? Nothing. Quite frankly, I say that the approach of the United Nations, in particular the Human Rights Commission in Geneva regarding the Syrian crisis, increases in deepening the disaster in which we live. The absurd war inside Syria are portrayed as a conflict between the forces of the state and the opposition forces. This is not true. The absurd war, which revolves in my country today, is a war between the Syrian civil society and the Islamic terrorist groups led by strangers from various countries and funded by strangers from various countries, especially Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, which considered finally those groups as terrorist organizations, is the country that sent, trained, and funded terrorism in order to destroy Syria. The story is ended with the FSA, and the arena is occupied by Islamic terrorist groups. We have reached out yesterday with Yabrud, another Syrian city that has been destroyed. 400 young Yabrudis, at least, want to turn from fighters against the state to fighters with the state. Raqqa is governed by Daesh, by iron and fire. A girl was killed there just because she possesses an account on Facebook. Churches in Raqqa has become a headquarters for Daesh. People are forced to pray 5 times a day, and women teams are dedicated to whip unveiled girls in the streets of Raqqa. Their resort is governed by the terrorist group called Jabhat al-Nusra. Secularists there are being killed just because they are secular. Latin Church was destroyed just as happened in Raqqa. Who are the leaders of Daesh and Al-Jabha? Qataris, Saudis, Chechens, Afghans, and even Chinese. Will these terrorists came to spread democracy and human rights in Syria? No. The problem is the international community. They do not want to see the truth and still believe that there is a delusion called the Free Syrian Army. Here we want to ask, what is the relationship between democracy and the girl that killed because she has an account on Facebook? What is the relationship between human rights and the destruction of the churches and synagogues? What is the relationship between freedom and the elimination of last Aramaic town in the world, Ma'lula? Questions wait the Mrs. Navi Pillay to answer on. What did Mrs. Navi Pillay do for the liberation of thousands of other detainees in the prison of Al-Tawba and Douma? What did she do to put an end to the tragedy of the 20th century, which happened before eyes and ears of the world? What have you done for the homeless people of Adra who are wandering in the streets of Damascus? What did you do to liberate women and children who were kidnapped by the Islamic terrorism from villages north of Latakia after killing of men? What did Mrs. Navi Pillay do to restore those simple peasants to their villages, yes, because they are Alawites. And Alawites have nothing to do with oil and gas states. The international community does not want to listen to their plight. Ismailis, in contrast, who usually were the masters of opposition in Syria, are exposed today to a form of genocide just because they are Ismailis. Ismailis suffered in Adra the worst kind of genocide. They have been also subjected in Al-Kafat to a terrorist attack that killed innocent. This is also the case of Tel Ad-Dura and Salamiyya. Ismailis are a small minority in the Syrian and Islamic world, so they don't find support from the organizers of the international affairs, who have no time to follow up their extermination at the hands of the Islamic terrorist groups. The situation of Christians is not better than other minorities. For example, Sadat, the Christian Syriac town, was attacked last summer by groups of Islamic terrorism, which killed, raped, and destroyed before leaving. They also attacked Ma'lula, stole homes, displaced people, and destroyed much of the historic features of the village for no other reasons but because the two towns are Christians. They had occupied the Christian towns in the countryside of Idlib. No need to remind you that they were responsible for the destruction of the Christian neighborhoods in the city of Homs and shelling the Christian neighborhood in Damascus by mortar every day.
I thank you all to be here, and I ask you also to make the real information beside you, all around. I want to, well, in my speech, I will only take an overall situation of all what we saw in, about Syria. So I remind, a little reminder, historical reminder, telling that Syria has been the cradle of civilization. Syria gave the world messages of civilization, of, sorry, I'm too much. Syria gave the world also the first music, alphabet, the first peace, treaties, and Syria is a real mosaic of people, of religions and spirits, and we live together from thousands of years. Syria has 10,000 years.